So 3 weeks since Operation Sindoor, the world is analyzing the impact of what India did between the 7th and the 10th of May and what it actually achieved and how this could set possibly a kind of a new normal, if you will, if, God forbid, there were to be another attack. An American non-profit think tank, the Stimson Center, has analyzed what India's air power achieved, what Pakistani air defenses achieved or did not achieve, and what more India needs to do to try and guard itself. Now, there's an early assessment, a long piece that has come out, an early assessment that the Stimson Center has gone through these 4 days between the 7th and the 10th of May, and they've come to some conclusions. The paper was written for the Stimson Center by Mr. Christopher Clary. We'll be speaking to him in a moment. But here are the 4 or 5 big, broad highlights from that study. Number one, how India demonstrated an ability to deliver precise attacks across large swathes of Pakistan on each of the days of this conflict, but particularly on the first day, which was the 7th of May, when it launched Operation Sindoor and those 9 terror bases were hit. And then subsequently, on the intervening night between the 9th and the 10th of May, when a large number of these air bases were hit. So the first set of strikes, they targeted Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and 2 places in heartland Punjab, Muridke and Bahawalpur. And then the second set of strikes, which were the air bases, that was across the length and breadth of Pakistan, all the way from Punjab down to Jacobabad in Sindh. Now, while Pakistani air defenses likely interfered or even intercepted some of these attempted strikes, Pakistan has a meaningful and serious vulnerability to an Indian air attack. And perhaps the next attack, if one were to come down to that, there could be something even more in terms of damage left behind than what we've seen in those 4 days between 7th and 10th of May. Pakistan, too, likely inflicted virtually no observable damage on Indian military units or facilities. That, I guess, is a testament to India's own air defenses. From May 8th through to May 10th, India's integrated air and missile defense systems appear to have largely defeated several waves of Pakistani drone attacks, which were ambiguous in its scope, scale, and intensity. Now, while the mutual possession of nuclear weapons heavily conditions the responses of both sides, certainly over the last 25 years since the Kargil War, overt nuclear signaling this time around was lower in the case of both countries than what we've seen in prior India-Pakistan crises. On the first day of the hostilities, which was May 7th, when India launched Operation Sindoor, India likely lost a few aircraft to Pakistani counter-air operations. The DG Air Ops was asked about this as to whether any air assets were lost, and he said yes, air assets have been lost, but he refused to qualify or quantify which or how many of these assets were lost. It also says, this analysis by the Stimson Center, how the United States likely played a major role in crisis management, particularly in the final hours of this crisis, and that no other alternative actor appears to have participated with the same efficacy as the United States. And this, of course, is a messaging that the Trump administration is doubling down on, as we saw in the court filing that they had before a trade court in Manhattan a few days ago, where it was revealed that Trump used trade as a bait, if you will, or as a means to try and get both India and Pakistan to back off. The author of this report at the Stimson Center is Christopher Clary. He's now joining us. He's a non-resident fellow. Thanks very much, Mr. Clary, for speaking with us. So let me take that first point about India delivering precise standoff attacks across large swathes of Pakistani territory on each day of the conflict, but particularly on the 7th and 10th of May. And you go on to say Pakistan has a meaningful and serious vulnerability to Indian air attacks. Can you elaborate from what you saw from the evidence of the damage left behind between 7th and 10th of May? How did India demonstrate this air superiority, and what may this mean in the context of, God forbid, the next escalation between these two countries?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I think India, to its great credit, starting with the briefings of the DGMO and the DG Air Ops and their naval counterpart on May 11th, has worked to showcase the capabilities by putting evidence in the public domain that is persuasive to outside audiences. So I think the rapid declassification release of satellite imagery helped outsiders know what was going on. And then in subsequent weeks, both Indian media outfits as well as international observers and think tanks have been able to draw upon commercial satellite imagery. And the evidence, I think, is clear that many Pakistani air bases, almost every air base that the Director General of Air Operations mentioned in his May 11th briefing, does show signs of damage. And in several cases, that damage may have had, lasting effect. In some of these places, we can see hangars are brought down. We don't know what was in that hangar. We don't know whether any aircraft were in those buildings that were hit, but it is possible that occurred. And in other cases, India opted for temporary effects. When you put a crater in a runway, it seems like it will be devastating for the airfield, but militaries all around the world practice on repairing it. What it does do, it take that airfield out of commission for several hours, maybe even a day, and those aircraft that are based there are not able to get into the sky and cause troubles. So whether or not that constituted air superiority, I think, is a separate question, because India used these new technologies that it's been developing over the last decade, principally the BrahMos, which it has co-developed with Russia, but also the Scalp missile that it acquired from the Europeans, to launch most of these attacks from dozens or maybe even hundreds of kilometers away. And those missiles got through. What does not appear to have occurred by the Indian Air Force or the Pakistani Air Force is neither Air Force thought it was safe enough to operate over the skies of the other country, given the residual air defenses that existed even on the Pakistani side.
So from whatever, has been released either by the, Air Force personnel or has been acquired by and is now in the public domain by, media centers and think tanks and so on, is it clear to you that at least 11 air bases were hit and at least in some of them there was significant damage in a way that the runway was rendered unusable? What, on the morning of the 10th, when the Rubio-Munir call happens, and obviously General Munir has this information that 11 air bases have been hit, how does that factor into his decision to say, okay, let's get off this thing now?
Sure. We have the most information about those final hours from Indian interlocutors discussing what occurred. We have a little bit of information from the Pakistani and the U.S. side. Both Pakistan and India want to project that the other side was the one that made the request. And it is very possible that Secretary Rubio, U.S. diplomats, who were sometimes acting as a conduit, may have encouraged the other side to believe that their opposite interlocutor was the one seeking a ceasefire, because that was in the U.S. interest, is to get to a ceasefire. However, what I think we can say about the events of May 10th is that the Pakistanis did desire that hostilities come to an end. They may have thought that their drone and missile attack on the early morning hours of May 10th achieved some result, even though the evidence for that is not clear on the Indian side. But they also may have just responded to the U.S.'s entreaties to bring the conflict to a close. So assuming the Indian chronology is accurate, and I see no reason to doubt that the testimony the Ministry of External Affairs gave to the parliament is roughly true, the Pakistani Director General of Military Operations, the DGMO, attempted to start contacting his Indian counterpart in the early morning of the 10th. And for reasons that are not entirely clear, India was hesitant to take that call. They have said that DGMO was busy. That's very possible. It's, a military campaign is underway. But by the early afternoon, the call is finally completed, according to the record that we have. And then by middle of the afternoon, an agreement for a ceasefire was reached, and that ceasefire took into effect just a few hours later.
So this whole stuff, the escalation that happens between the 9th and the 10th, and clearly on the one side you can see the damage that's been caused to these various airfields and air bases. On the Indian side too, there has been damage, comparatively less compared to what the damage is in Pakistan. What does that say to you about the air defense systems of both countries. And again, if another war or a conflict or an escalation were to break out between India and Pakistan, especially something that you said in your previous answer, that aircraft on either side were perhaps hundreds of kilometers inside the line of control or the international border, does that dramatically raise the risk of further escalation if, God forbid, another terror attack were to happen and India decides to retaliate for that with some kind of reprisal action?
I think India has some tough choices about what it would do if there was, sadly, the murder or a terrorist attack against Indian civilians in the future. You have seen credible Indian voices. I saw a piece by retired Lieutenant General Saini just a few weeks ago saying that India should try to be prompt and not necessarily expansive with future attacks. That's something we see Israel doing sometimes with just a quick hit, maybe even the night after an attack, to restore deterrence rather than a larger campaign such as India opted for in Operation Sindoor here. So I think that is something the Indian military will have to consider. But, on both sides, they'll have homework to do. As you mentioned in your introduction, I do think the Indian Air Force may have lost assets on the first night, though the Indian Air Force has said all pilots, thankfully, came home. But that's an expensive lesson to learn, and India will have to, I think, did make operational changes that meant that we don't have evidence of additional losses on subsequent nights of the conflict. And then Pakistan, I think, will have to consider why there was not more visible damage on the Indian side. It may want to think about systems that are closer and more equivalent to what the BrahMos and Scalp brought to the table.
What about the air defenses on either side?
Well, I think air defenses did work on the Indian side largely, especially against, I think, these cheaper drones that Pakistan deployed on the nights of the 7th and the 8th and into the beginning of the 9th. We don't really know, and I would encourage the government of India to perhaps reveal more about the types of drone systems that Pakistan used. There is a lot of debris of cheaper drones as well as some Turkish origin drones. Yeah. But the Indian government has said that larger systems were also used. But I do think the Indian Integrated Air Defense System, the managers of that system, should be pleased with how it dealt with this crisis, but with an understanding that Pakistan won't do the same thing again the next time. And so I do think India will have to keep modernizing on its defensive side as well.
The HQ-9, which is the Chinese air defense system which Pakistan uses, at least in some places, seems to have been breached.
What I think is clear is the Pakistani air defense system was not able to stop these faster and stealthier cruise missiles that India had. We do see some debris of those missiles, in some cases short of a logical target. So the Pakistanis likely had some ability to intercept munitions that were going through their airspace, but it wasn't adequate, and especially as the conflict went on. The Pakistani systems may have faced some damage and destruction from India's Israeli origin drones that it employed beginning on the morning of May 8th. So I think Pakistan will have to take a serious relook at its air defense system. And India, for its part, should know that Pakistan will be working in that regard as well.
And one final word. I mean, you talked about the U.S. role, and you write in this analysis that the U.S. likely played a major role in crisis management, particularly in the final hours of this crisis. What is conceivable is another actor could not have played this role as crisis communicator of choice for both combatants, or some alternative third parties did play the role of crisis diplomacy, but none of those actors appear to have participated with the same efficacy as the U.S. And this is a messaging that India has been pushing back on for a number of weeks now, saying that there was no third-party mediation. Certainly there was no U.S. mediation in this. And two, also this whole business about using trade as some kind of bait or leverage. The Trump administration seems to be doubling down on that, including in the court filing that we saw, which was revealed yesterday when the verdict came out from the court. But again, the Indian side says that none of these conversations that Jaishankar had with Rubio or Vance had with Modi had anything to do with trade.
Yeah, I think this is a puzzle that we'll have to figure out because the U.S. side and the Indian side are at some variance, and for the U.S. government to file something in court is not the same thing as a social media post. So there is some gravity there. I think there's also some confusion of why the Secretary of State said there had been talks agreed to at a neutral site, which is something the government of India also has said did not occur. So the only people privy to those phone calls are in the U.S. and Indian government, and while they are disagreeing about some of those facts, New Delhi more vociferously than Washington, we'll have to wait until some sort of more authoritative account comes forward that allows us to adjudicate between those rival claims.
All right, Mr. Christopher Clary, thank you very much for your analysis and, of course, for your time given for this interview. Thank you indeed.
Thank you.